I guess I should.
Does this say live? Welcome to Our Front Porch on a beautiful day. It's a perfect day to sit on the porch, don't you gentlemen think?
Sure. I agree.
Yeah, we're joined by our regular Larry Balsamo,
Evening.
facilitator, historian, and we're welcoming back Keith. Welcome back, Keith.
Thank you.
Boeckelman, political science professor at WIU. So tonight we're tackling a very interesting topic: 5 impeachments for presidents. Did I get it right?
Yes, you got it.
Okay. So the thing about Our Front Porch is that we gather together and share information that we know and ask questions. So I also think it might be interesting, I don't know about you, but it's kind of uncommon that we would have, in my lifetime, experienced 4 impeachments.
It's one of the things we're going to talk about, I think.
Yeah. So I remember, and maybe you can share it in the comments section, when Nixon gave his resignation speech. I was at Girl Scout camp downstate, and no TV for a couple of weeks and tons of mosquito bites. And they gathered us all into the dining hall and made us watch the resignation because it was a historical event. And just the sound of his voice, it just was really, has always stuck with me. So please, share your experiences with impeachments in the comments section. And that's another kind of interesting way we can learn from each other. And if you have questions, you can toss those down there and we'll forward them to our guests on the stage. And also sometimes you just don't know how to form a question, but if you'd like them to address a topic or a time period, or what does it mean by this, or could you talk a little bit about that, feel free to do that too. This is something for you to get some information about. It. Sort of you're directing the conversation. Is that okay with you?
Sure. Well, that's fine.
Great.
All right, well, let's get to that. 8:30 is our cutoff point, and I'm going to turn over to Larry to get the ball rolling.
Okay, we're ready. Hi again. We have a repeat guest tonight, my colleague, my good friend, Keith Boeckelman, who's chair of the political science department and interim chair of the history department, which I was in for many, many years. We talk a lot about topics. We talk about impeachment. We're a lot of fun. We did a topic before back in November on the presidential election, which engendered lots of comments and a lot of soul searching. So the topics are sort of connected, although at the time we had no idea there was going to be another impeachment procedure against a sitting president, soon to be an ex-president. So we thought it'd be a good time to talk about presidential impeachments in this country. There have been 4 presidents subjected to impeachment proceedings, 4 of which went to their fruition. That is, there was a trial and a verdict. 1 didn't, but it led to the resignation of that one president. So we thought this would be a good chance for us to look at the overview and the specific ones. And if you've got questions about specific impeachments, we'll do our best to address them. Evening, Keith. Welcome.
Thank you. I guess you could call me a repeat offender, maybe.
Yes, a repeat offender and defender.
Okay.
Are you open with any statements or any comments, or should we just flow into it?
Why don't we just go into it?
Okay. So you're a political scientist, right? Are you surprised by the number of impeachment proceedings we've had in the last 25 or 30 years?
Well, I think it's something that once it gets started, it snowballs and feeds on itself. There was a book, an important book in political science that came out around the time of the Clinton impeachment called Politics by Other Means. And the premise of this book is that it was harder and harder, particularly in Congress, to defeat incumbents, to win elections, and to have a party change in Congress. And so as a result of that, politicians needed to turn to other means besides elections to initiate changes in power. And so I think impeachment now has become one of those tools. And I think once you do it once, it becomes easier to do it again. I mean, I think the losing side, so to speak, in an impeachment says, okay, well, we're going to get back at you by impeaching your guy. As an example, and I think this sort of addresses one of the questions that was raised, there's already talk about, for example, impeaching President Obama, even though his term's over, and things like that. So I think it is consistent with this idea of politics by other means of using non-electoral methods to try to gain power or to dislodge your political opponents from power.
For a long time, when I was teaching history, the only example you had of impeachment of a president was Andrew Johnson, who, other than that, is about one of the most obscure presidents ever in 1868, and that failed by one vote under very suspicious circumstances. We can revisit that, but one of the theories was the succeeding presidents of the Gilded Age were, generally speaking, nondescript and fairly weak and not very assertive. Is there a kind of a sense, or is there a theory that political scientists used to have that this kind of impeachment takes away the boldness from a president or the risk-taking or leadership?
Well, I think that's possible. I'm sure you're familiar with the idea of the imperial president. Sure. That concept arose, in the 60s and 70s, particularly with Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon. And so the idea that the presidency had gotten too powerful. As I'm sure you also know, the fear of the founders is that Congress would be the most dangerous branch and that they need to be restricted. But I think, now we've seen there's a lot more that Congress has essentially become toothless and dysfunctional in many ways and can't really make policy, and that the president has taken on more and more power. So I guess from my perspective, I wouldn't be worried about impeachment checking the president's power. I do think that maybe it's a way of Congress trying to reassert its own power. I'm not sure that's the best way to do it. I would rather see other methods of Congress trying to reassert its power. But I do think that's something that's needed. We talked a little bit about this when we had our previous meeting, but I do share the view that it's dangerous from a constitutional perspective if the president is making all the policy decisions, the president is overusing executive orders, and things like that. So I think we've gotten to a situation where the president has become inordinately, in my view, powerful. Congress is either unwilling or unable to put much of a check on that, except perhaps through impeachment. So I guess I would rather see Congress act through the judicial oversight process to try to check. But during the Trump administration in particular, that essentially broke down, particularly in the House. I would say that Congress was unable to effectively check the president through oversight. So I think this leads to impeachment. And again, I'm not worried about the president losing power so much, but I am worried about this impeachment, that it really becomes such a distraction that the whole system gets sand in the gears, so to speak.
Before we move to look at some of the specific presidents, do you think it's constitutional to impeach a president who's no longer in office? Now, I know the process of Trump started when he was president, and it reflected on actions he'd taken as president. But he was out of office by the time the dust settled and so forth. What do you think about that?
Well, let me give you kind of the arguments on both sides on that. So on the one hand, there are a couple let me say this. The legal scholars that have studied this seem to be more on the side, certainly not universally, but more on the side that it is constitutional to impeach a president. And some of the arguments they use for that is there have been cases in American history where not presidents, but officials have been impeached after they left office. One example during the Grant administration, I believe William Belknap, who was Secretary of War. Yeah. He was, the impeachment process started, then he left office. He was not ultimately removed from office. He was not convicted by the Senate, but the Senate did vote that it was legitimate for them to pursue the conviction after office. Other arguments that are made are more historical. During the Constitutional Convention, for example, there was a high-profile case of impeachment in England, and the authors of the Constitution were apparently very familiar with this case. They discussed it in the debates of the Constitutional Convention. And so the argument is that if they would have been opposed to this idea of, not allowing someone who had been out of office to be impeached, then they would have seen what was going on in England and said, no, we don't want this, but they didn't do that. The other side is that there are a couple of references in the Constitution to that mention the office of the president, implying at least that impeachment only applies to the office holder, and so that you have to actually be in office in order to be impeached. So again, I don't think it's a clear-cut thing either way. I guess, one other thing I would say, there was a case of a judge, Walter Nixon, in the 80s, and not to be confused with Richard Nixon, who was impeached.
No relation.
No relation, yeah. And he, in that case, there were some questions about the constitutionality. He had left office also. And it went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court basically says the Senate's business to decide what the rules are on this. So, implying that there was not a constitutional issue in this case, that rather if the Senate wanted to do this, that they were within their rights constitutionally to do it.
So the impeachment isn't a political process.
Impeachment is absolutely a political process, yes.
Walk us through the difference between a political process and criminal judicial process. I mean, they look the same from a distance, but when you get right down to it, for example, there's no built-in penalty for being found guilty on impeachment charges. Losing office, then the Senate can vote to ban you from running for office again. But that's not a given. I mean, that's not a requirement. I mean, there's no prison term assigned to it.
Well, you're right. All those things are true. I mean, I guess in that sense, it's almost more like a civil punishment, like a lawsuit or something like that. But I think in addition to those, one key difference is when you're accused of a crime, there's usually some kind of statute, whether it's murder or speeding or whatever. It lays out in the statute, this is what this crime is, and this is what the punishment is. Now, the punishment is laid out, but there's no specific statutory agreement on what the actual crime is. It's ambiguous in the Constitution to some degree. It lays out treason, for example, as a justification for impeachment and removal, bribery. But then it has this language of high crimes and misdemeanors. And so that's where the tricky part comes in. It's not been clear historically what high crimes and misdemeanors mean. Again, looking at the debates over the Constitutional Convention, the consensus seems to be that a high crime or misdemeanor doesn't have to be an actual crime. It could involve things like abuse of office that is not criminal. One example from the debate over during the Constitutional Convention would be not illegally, but wrongfully removing a public official. Interfering in elections was another thing they're concerned about. Now, in some cases, that can be illegal as well.
Founding fathers were really concerned about that too.
They are very concerned about that.
And
so, I think particularly in the Nixon case, where he was maybe not directly involved with the planning, but at least the cover-up of attempts to influence the 1972 election, that was a big issue. So I think there's a lot of ambiguity compared to a regular criminal trial where exactly what the offense is you're being accused of, and it's clear what guilt and innocence is. Another, I guess, issue is that in an impeachment trial, the jurors are making the rules as well. So the Senate, they serve as jurors, but they're making the rules of evidence and so forth, the things like that you would normally expect a judge to do. So there's a little bit of a confluence of the roles that would be typical for a normal trial. But I think the key point is that it's not always clear what an impeachable offense is. Gerald Ford once famously said an impeachable offense is whatever Congress decides it is. And Nancy Pelosi at one point sort of said the same thing, and then she kind of backed away from that. But so I think that's a clear difference.
I've always found the case of Andrew Johnson interesting because he's an accidental president. Vice president of his predecessor was assassinated. He's a man with a world of political experience. He'd been governor, senator, congressman, mayor, all kinds of things. He was a man of real courage. Yet, by the time he became president, the issues were so heated that he issued 29 different vetoes. And all of his previous predecessors, all 15 of them, did a total of 59. 6 were overridden. He had 15 overridden out of 29. He was president for just a little bit less than 4 years. And in his case, he specifically violated a statute passed by Congress, which had a criminal penalty with it, fine and or prison, or both. And so when he was brought up on charge of impeachment, the Tenure of Office Act, it was pretty clear what he had done. And there had been like 3 or 4 years of intense political warfare between he and Congress over a whole bunch of really tough issues. A lot of them had to do with race. I mean, that's the key issues in the 1860s and 70s. And he escaped out. He escaped out of it, by one vote and under very mysterious circumstances. I've always found it interesting that the people of Tennessee, the state legislature of Tennessee, reelected him to the United States Senate in 1874, and he served about 6 months before he died. I mean, how would you like to have Nixon show up in the United States Senate, or Bill Clinton? That's
or Donald Trump.
Donald Trump. I mean, that's
maybe he'll run against Marco Rubio now or something.
Yeah, I mean, there'd be a lot of commentary on that. CNN would never slow down. Nor would Fox.
But to that point, I guess I also want to make the observation that the founders did not want impeachment to be solely about policy differences. Now, as you said, Johnson committed an actual crime too, but they did not see impeachment as a way to resolve policy differences. That if Congress and the president disagree on,
and the Supreme Court has always viewed this as a political issue, not a constitutional issue, so they stay out of it.
Right.
Aside from the Chief Justice presiding over the procedure.
Yeah.
Sue, any questions?
One kind of related to that, what you were talking about, the accidental president from Jeff Higgins. He says he's reading a book named The Accidental President. It discusses a plan by the Whigs to impeach John Tyler.
Yes.
Are you familiar with this?
Yes, a little bit.
It had to do with the annexation of Texas.
Yeah. Tyler was not only an accidental president when William Henry Harrison died a month after his inauguration. Some think it was because he caught a bad cold giving the longest inaugural address in the history of the country. Harrison was a Whig president. That was one of the two political parties. And Tyler, at that time, was a Whig, but he was really a states' rights Democrat from Virginia and pro-slavery. And he'd had issues with the Whig leadership over tariffs and banking and all kinds of stuff. And Tyler and his wife, by the way, who was one of the first really active first ladies, sort of politically, wanted to push the annexation of Texas for a lot of reasons. It was a big state, strategically located. It was a slave state. It expanded U.S. territory dramatically. And there was talk of impeaching him over this. It never got out of committee. My understanding is that a couple of Whig congressmen came up with it as a form of punishment. And understand that if he is impeached and driven out of office, there was no vice president. So the president would have been the president pro tem of the Senate, who was Henry Clay. And Clay always wanted to be president anyway. So there was all this sort of thing going on. There were also impeachment resolutions discussed about James Buchanan, which never got very far. Andrew Jackson was censured by the Senate in 1834 because he'd vetoed a bill rechartering the Bank of the United States. And the Senate then was in the opposition party, which is another issue. Almost always it's the opposition party to the president that's behind these impeachment proceedings, which is maybe, again, the way the Founding Fathers sort of assumed it would be, although it's hard to figure out they knew anything about parties. They thought about factions and that sort of thing, but
well, I mean, to that point, the reason the conviction is in the Senate apparently was Alexander Hamilton was concerned about that partisan idea, and he thought the Senate would be more deliberative body and the calmer, less partisan. Even though, as you say, they didn't really understand parties the way we do now.
And remember, the Senate wasn't directly elected by the people; it was
Right,
by the state legislature, which was another layer. Anyway, there was a censure motion passed against Andrew Jackson in 1834. And just before he left office in early 1837, the Senate changed its mind and literally erased it out of the Senate Journal. I mean, they had somebody cross it out to expunge that. As far as I know, that's the only time there's been a censure resolution successful against the President of the United States. There's been talk of it a lot, and that was perhaps an option that they could have used this time, a censure, but that wouldn't have justified removing him from serving for office again. It's still...
No, but you may recall that there was a lot of talk about that during the Clinton impeachment as well. That in fact, the political organization MoveOn.org, their name came from that idea of censure him and then move on. And so
go on to something else. I find it interesting. Andrew Johnson, as an accidental president, was not going to be renominated or reelected in 1868. Richard Nixon, by Constitution, couldn't serve more than 2 terms, so he was into his second term. The same is true of Clinton. The differences in Trump, this was before the end of his first term, and he was obviously going to be running for office again. And since he was not found guilty of impeachment charges, he could run for office again in 2024 without any constitutional handicap. So the timing is really crucial in a lot of these things.
Right. And I think, that was part of the impetus, maybe the primary impetus of having this retrial at the end of President Trump's term, and even when he was out of office, the idea of the Constitution gives the option of not allowing a convicted president to run again, although there has to be a separate vote on that. And so I think that's at least part of what was driving this. But I also think that as we have already talked about, it was political in the sense that the Democrats wanted to get this idea out there that Trump is a bad guy, and tying him to the events of January 6th in particular. And so I think realistically they had to know there was no real chance of him being convicted, but doing this anyway to try to make this larger political point and to try to discredit Trump and some of his allies.
I think probably everybody in this room and many of the viewers out there lived through the Nixon impeachment crisis, which in many ways is the best documented and the most interesting human side, and from the political side and all kinds of precedent setting. Nixon had been reelected by a huge whopping majority, maybe one of the biggest in the history of the country. I think McGovern carried South Dakota.
No, I don't think he even got. He got Massachusetts.
Massachusetts, that's it.
I think that might have been D.C. I think those might have been.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, that's a real licking. Yeah. And why Nixon couldn't have seen that coming and instead took all these foolish, illegal chances, breaking into the Watergate, authorizing the break-in of a psychiatrist, of the man who let go of the Pentagon Papers, authorizing all kinds of secret tricks, political tricks.
Well, Rich Philippink, who I know has appeared in this series as well, he gave another talk on that at the Hallwist lecture, I guess a year or two ago, and he made the point, which I wasn't really aware of, is that when a lot of this stuff was going on, the polls were much tighter, mm-hmm. and it looked like that Nixon did have a real fear based on polling data, so that he could lose the election. Now, it turned out that was not really realistic, but that he didn't know at the time that McGovern was going to be his opponent. McGovern was probably a relatively weak.
And McGovern's vice president was going to turn out to have had shock treatments, right, to be replaced.
And so that he had, not to justify what he did, but that he had legitimate fears that he could have lost the 1972 election, a year and a half, 2 years before the actual election.
He won the 1968 election by a really pretty narrow margin.
Right, and also had lost the 1960 election by a very narrow margin.
And the governorship of California in 1962.
And so he had experience with, winning by a hair and losing by a hair. And so I think he did. And we I guess, our demographic here who remembers the Nixon era knows he was kind of a paranoid guy anyway. So that was. Would it be fair to, and this is something we haven't talked about, to think about all 5 of these presidents as having a serious personal flaw? I mean, Nixon seems almost paranoid, and he keeps an enemies list. Clinton has sexual indulgences he cannot apparently control. Lord knows what is going on with Trump's mind. I mean, people have accused him of being crazy and paranoid and schizophrenic and all these kinds of things. I don't know about that. Andrew Johnson was a hater. He could not let an enemy get away. I mean, he spent his life hating his opponents. Yeah, that's an interesting point. I do think there's probably something to that. I mean, if you compare, like with other recent presidents who seemed much more mentally stable, like Obama, George W. Bush, I mean, both Bushes, frankly, or Reagan, you don't have these sort of seething inner demons, it seems like, that are, and I think that may be also what drives presidents in these impeachable offenses is that their personality may be unbalanced in some ways. They may have boundary issues or whatever it is.
Somebody described one of Andrew Johnson's political enemies said of him, if Andy Johnson was a snake, he'd lie in the grass and bite the heels of rich men's children, because he hated rich people. He'd grown up from the bottom. He was almost no education at all, and he bore grudges. And it's interesting, Lincoln came from sort of the same background, but his struggle to be somebody elevated him.
Right.
And for Johnson, it turned him inward. Any more questions, Sue?
I do have one more question.
Okay.
Tabby asks, many people tend to get the House and Senate roles of the impeachment process mixed up. As in thinking one is impeached when the president is removed from office by the Senate. Why does this happen?
You're up, Keith. You're a political scientist.
Why is it a 2-step process?
I think that would be a good interpretation of that question.
Well, it's sort of like in a criminal trial, the idea of indictment versus the actual trial itself. And so the House would be sort of the equivalent of a grand jury. That's not used so much in Illinois, but many states have a grand jury system where the prosecutor presents the case and the grand jury decides if there's a legitimate reason for it to go forward. And so the House is not really weighing in on guilt or innocence. It's really, is there enough, or the idea at least is there enough evidence in place that this should go forward? And then the Senate is supposed to be the jury, in effect. And so, as I mentioned earlier, the idea was that Alexander Hamilton, among other founders, was that the jury would be more likely to be the more impartial of the two. And so when the actual trial takes place, if you want to have an impartial jury, it's better to have that before the Senate. The idea of the House was that it would be closer to the people and therefore more subject to emotion and whims. And so it was often considered too dangerous to put these kind of final decisions in the hands of the House. And so I think that's the rationale for having this 2-step process. It is confusing, I think, because people use this term impeachment to mean removal from office sometimes, and the president, you're going to impeach a president, and they take that to mean taking them out of office, but of course it doesn't mean that. It just means they've gone to that next step where the Senate then would either decide to convict them or not. And as Larry has said, the Senate has never actually done so.
No, and one of the things is in impeachment procedures that I know of, I think it's true in all of them, at least the 4 that reached fruition. Unlike a jury in a criminal case, which deliberates in secret and then comes out with a verdict without identifying how everybody voted on that jury, in the Senate, they vote by yay or nay. I mean, they vote verbally. At least they did in Andrew Johnson's case, and they certainly did in Clinton's and in Trump's. So they're on the record, and so they stand or fall on that. And every senator knows about the political ramifications of what they're doing.
Right.
And one thing about it, I think at least from Andrew Johnson, and then we got to remember the middle of the 19th century, the impeachment procedures since that time have been more open. I mean, that is, they're more in public. That is, there's more talk about it on the talking heads. The people involved talk about it. They leak information and so forth. One of the things that Andrew Johnson's defense lawyers, and he had a really good team, they convinced him to shut up. He didn't give any public statements at all during the whole procedure. That was against his nature. If he goes out and talks, he's going to lose, I think. Let's go back to Nixon for a second. Would it be a fair statement that Nixon would have lived out his second term had he not taped what was going on in his office?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the tapes were the death knell, not only legally, but politically. It seems quaint now, but I remember, these tapes coming out, the president's cursing and things like that. And that was really very shocking to people at the time. Now, I think we would probably not be particularly shocked by that, given a recent president's Twitter account, for example. But certainly the idea that, some of the things the president talked about, of course, there was this famous gap in the tapes, which may have been the real death knell for Nixon. But I think when the tapes came out, that was really the beginning of the end for Nixon. And I think it really convinced people of his guilt. It gave clear evidence of his guilt, and also reinforced, I think, some of his less appealing qualities as a human
anti-Semitism. He uses racial slurs.
Right.
He swears. I mean, they came out with a published edition and they had expletive deleted. It seemed like every other sentence was that way.
Right.
That's probably the way a lot of people talk in Washington, particularly a group of white guys who are not going to be heard. Nobody knew about this taping system except maybe 4 or 5 people. Nixon knew about it, a couple of Secret Service people, Alexander Butterfield, who let it fly at a Senate hearing. And
that was sort of accidental, if I remember correctly, that he revealed that
at a deposition.
Yeah.
And then too late, Nixon pulls the tape out in the summer of 1973. He stops taping everything. And I don't know if any succeeding presidents have used it or not.
Yeah, I doubt that they have. I don't know of that, but anything that they do or say on a tape like that would have to be turned over according to the Presidential Records Act.
Yeah, the Presidential Records Act.
They would.
It pertains to stuff from computers and from memos, written memos, telephone conversations, that sort of thing. Yeah, it's a federal offense to jimmy with that. Let me back up a second. There are at least 5 or 6 different entities which seem to be after Nixon as president all at the same time. You got special prosecutor. You got Judge Sirica in the criminal courts. You've got the Senate Watergate Committee. You've got the House Judiciary Committee involved in the impeachment. You've got Woodward and Bernstein, plus almost every press person in the world. Can you isolate which one of those was the most important in causing Nixon to decide on impeachment?
Well, I think it's hard to just identify one. I mean, for example, you mentioned Woodward and Bernstein, and if they wouldn't have gotten on this story, then of course I think Nixon would have served out his second term. But I was fairly young when this happened, but I guess the thing that kind of sticks with me.
Me too, just for the record.
Well, okay, yeah.
Jeez, gotta stop asking young people these things.
Well, I'm not that young.
You're younger than I am.
Check my driver's license here, but I think what I remember from that time, and I guess just read about it after, is when some of the Republicans, like Howard Baker, and some of the House Republicans also turned on Nixon. I think that was really a turning point. I think unlike, some of these recent ones where they have been pretty partisan, with the exception, of course, of Trump's second one, where there was a little bit of spillover. I think that when some of the leading figures and I guess maybe that's a contrast too with Trump. Howard Baker and some of these people were considered really the leaders of the Republican Party, whereas people like Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy were not the people who turned on Trump, although Mitch McConnell's been kind of all over the place in certain
sure
ways.
has.
So I guess to me, that was the most important thing is this idea of people in the prominent people in the president's own party, both in the House and in the Senate, saying, no, this is unacceptable, that this is an
I think even Barry Goldwater went to him and said, you've got to get out,
Yeah.
On the House Judiciary Committee, which is 39 members, 21 Democrats, 17 Republicans. On two of the articles of impeachment, 6 and then 7 Republicans voted for, including Tom Railsback, who was then our congressman. But some pretty conservative Republicans had been offended by what they heard or what they think they heard or what they thought they were going to hear. When Nixon lost the Supreme Court decision about the tapes, the handwriting was on the wall. The other thing is it strikes me that much of the strength of the Republican Party in the 1960s and 70s was traditional Republican. The Midwest, Arizona, John Rhodes and Barry Goldwater, Everett Dirksen, people like that. Now the center of the Trump political party seems to have shifted southward and to the mountain states. And so some of the traditional Republican, which we assume was the kind of traditional moderate Republican, fiscal issues very conservative, but other issues more malleable, had a much bigger influence on Nixon than that kind of partisanship does now on Trump.
Well, and I think that's an interesting point because Nixon, in a lot of ways, was really the key actor in starting that realignment, but it wasn't far enough along.
That's right.
At that point. And I guess what I mean by that is as Larry's saying, the energy in the party shifted in south and to some degree west to more socially conservative rather than economically conservative Republican Party. But that had not played out because Nixon was really kind of starting this in 1968, in the 1968 election in particular. And so a lot of the congressional leaders and a lot of the other leading lights in the Republican Party were still more aligned with this older idea of the Republicans as a pro-business party.
Free trade,
and sort of more moderate on racial issues, more moderate on social issues.
I think I read somewhere that toward the end, somebody told Nixon if he came to vote impeachment in the Senate, he could only count on 6 or 8 or 10 votes to sustain him, and they were all senior Southern Democrats,
right?
Like people like Harry Byrd and folks like that, who mostly were supporting the concept of the presidency, and they were also feeling the fact that the party shifting was going to the South a little bit. You're a member of the Republican Party and you're a senator. In 1974, and the impeachment trial comes to you on the charges that the House committee voted on: obstruction of justice, abuse of power. How do you vote? Yes to convict?
In Nixon's case?
Yes.
Yeah, I would vote yes to convict. I think the idea is that elections are sacred. And I know there's this debate about, whether the U.S. is a democracy or a republic, and certainly we're not a pure democracy. But with that said, the founders, with all the restrictions on the franchise that they accepted and so forth and so on, did feel like the election of elected officials was a very important process that shouldn't be tampered with. And so, even if with, again, the restrictions on the right to vote and sort of the anti-democratic features of the Constitution, they believe that the election process itself should not be tampered with. And so from that perspective, that's what Nixon was trying to do, in my view, tamper with election, affect the outcome of an election. And to me, that's almost the worst thing you can do from an impeachable offense standpoint.
The other interesting thing is this is the first impeachment process where the 25th Amendment came into play, which was the replacing of a president or vice president. I mean, we had about a year where we had 2 presidents of the United States, Nixon and Ford, and 3 vice presidents. I mean, what other democracy is going to survive something like that?
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, you also have the whole Spiro Agnew drama that goes into this when he
nolo contendere, no contest.
Right,
even taking bribes,
and so he's out the door before Nixon. So that, So I mean, that would be, if that had not been in play, that would be an interesting situation if there had been no vice president. I don't know who would have been president then.
Well, I mean, if there's no vice president, then they changed the succession law to, I think it was the Speaker of the House.
Well, Speaker of the House now, but before that, was that the case?
I can't remember.
They
changed it too. I know in the 19th century it was a president pro tem, which in the case of Andrew Johnson was a senator from Ohio, and Benjamin Wade, who, by the way, voted to find Johnson guilty. So that's okay. One of Johnson's son-in-laws was a senator from Tennessee, and he voted too. So. Let's go on to Bill Clinton. This is the one that seems kind of shrouded in obscurity. That is, by the way, if you want to read a book on Nixon impeachment, I recommend, and it's called The Wars of Watergate, and it's by Irving Cutler, who's a professor of history at University of Wisconsin. Now, I'll warn you, this book is huge. It must be 700 or 800 pages. But it's absolutely full of anecdotes and stories and inside stuff. It's well researched, and he also interviewed a lot of the people involved in it. It's in paperback, but it's a big book, and it's going to take you a couple of weeks to read it if you put some dedicated time into it. Any other questions, Sue?
How about from our
Anybody here?
audience? Anybody have anything?
No? We stumped them into quietness.
What are you, my class?
That's right. This is going to be on the test, you understand. Okay, let's go. Let's look a little bit about Clinton. Can you think of a modern day president who had more political skills than Clinton?
No. No. I mean, I think, in certain ways, Obama was certainly a generational political talent, but no, I would not put him ahead of Clinton. I would honestly say that, I mean, Trump has a lot of sort of gut level political talent as well.
Instincts.
Instinctual, yeah. I mean, I don't think much of his policy positions or his policy knowledge, maybe I should say, but it just as a political level is sort of understanding the gut level, particularly the framework of his supporters. I think Trump is maybe an underrated political talent, but that said, no, I don't think anybody, I mean, even, I'm trying to think in American history, certainly presidents like Franklin Roosevelt or Lincoln would be, but like you sort of alluded to earlier, I mean, Clinton was an incredible political talent, but also a flawed person that I think allowed him to, or led him to get into trouble in ways that maybe some of the other historically, and that he could have been a more historically important president if it hadn't been for these sort of character flaws.
It's a little strange. It's hard to think of Lincoln having sex in the Oval Office, isn't it? Or the president. It just doesn't seem to fit somehow. Right? But Clinton could give really good speeches. He knew how to bridge gaps. He managed to work with Newt Gingrich in a Republican Congress. He handled foreign policy with considerable deftness. He had empathy. At least he displayed what people thought was empathy. He was certainly intelligent, quick-witted. He managed to get reelected. He got elected twice. Interestingly enough, both times without winning a majority of the popular vote, but those were three-way contests. I mean, he's the last Democrat to carry Arizona till now, since 1948. I mean, he had marvelous skills.
Yeah, I mean, I think particularly this combination, which is unusual, of being an incredibly good public speaker, but also an incredibly good retail politician.
Yeah.
I mean, like to contrast with Obama, maybe he was an incredible speaker and he was a good retail politician, but he didn't seem to he didn't seem to enjoy it the same way. And I don't think that sort of connection. I'm just thinking back in the 90s, and I remember, and I can't really say this the way the student said it because the expletives would have to be deleted, but the student I had met Clinton and just sort of swooning over him. And I think both men and women just felt this immediate connection with Clinton that, he was just an amazing retail politician.
Yeah.
In addition to all his other skills.
I mean, that's a rare gift. And it came across on television very well, but apparently it also came across incredibly in personal contact with people or in public speaking to a live audience. I mean, that's just a kind of gift you don't see very often. And yet, while he remained personally popular as president, even undergoing impeachment, you get the sense that he frittered away his gifts. Don't you sort of feel that?
Absolutely, yeah. I think he, again, is an incredible political talent, but it's as old as mythology that people who have these incredible gifts but also incredible flaws, and I guess it's a human story. I mean, I think another one maybe was like that Lyndon Johnson, that had incredible political skills, but also these flaws that led him to be not what he could have been as a president.
Who was Kenneth Starr?
Well, Kenneth Starr was the special prosecutor who was involved in starting with the Whitewater scandal, which you may remember, involving these sort of questionable land deals that Clinton got involved with, and then sort of continuing these investigations and tendrils of various investigations until at one point the name of Monica Lewinsky got dropped into his lap, and he saw this as kind of a way to extend his investigation into Clinton. And so he was able, through the course of his various investigations, to get Clinton to lie before, I believe it was a grand jury, about his relationship with Monica Lewinsky. And then that was picked up by the House of Representatives in impeachable offense that he lied under oath.
She did.
Excuse me. And so in that respect, possibly a high crime.
The other side of the Clinton coin is there were people who hated him. I mean, you just saw him as a fraud. What's the nickname? Slick Willie.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a sleaze factor to the Clintons, in fact, and they were big in a pretty small rural state that was then mostly Democratic, Arkansas, and they got involved in a real estate deal, which involved Hillary Clinton also working in the best law firm in Arkansas, the Rose Law Firm. And it involved various people that were friends and colleagues over a real estate scam. Now, Starr's investigation of the Whitewater turned up nothing tangible. He essentially admitted that. But he had authority to follow all the leads. And it was her name? Paula Jones had filed suit against Clinton for sexual impropriety when he was governor.
Yes. And later, he was accused of rape, essentially, of other women.
That's the word. And some of the people who turned evidence against him were state patrolmen in Arkansas, part of his own detail. Her case was later thrown out because she couldn't prove any damage. But that case led to Monica Lewinsky. Remember Linda Tripp, the woman who was her mentor, taped her talking about Bill Clinton. And she's the one that turned that tape over to Kenneth Starr and other people. And so they got Clinton essentially red-handed. That's the only way you can say it, right? And he also apparently encouraged her to lie under oath, and some of his staff people to also lie under oath. Vernon Jordan, who just died,
passed, yeah.
he instructed him to get her a job to shut her up. So he covered. Again, politicians don't seem to learn. It's not necessarily the crime you commit. It's covering it up
Right.
that seems to do that. Okay. I mean, Nixon could have said, look, some of my associates got out of hand. We should never have done this. We should never have broken into Watergate, but they covered it up instead.
And it's pretty clear, I mean, Nixon was giving the plumbers, who this organization that was actually trying to bug the Democratic phones in the Watergate Hotel, which was the genesis of the scandal, that he was giving them a pretty wide leeway to do dirty tricks against the Democrats. But it's not clear that he knew about this actual thing before the fact, or this actual crime before the fact. And I think, as you say, if he would have come out and said, look, I didn't know about this, but this is wrong, I condemn this, probably would have been a blip on the radar.
And he apparently authorized the payment of hush money when these guys were convicted.
Right.
Hunt and Liddy and those people. He authorized at least indirectly the payment of hush money. What's it in the tape of June 23rd? Oh, and you seem to think the thing to do is to get the FBI or the CIA to tell the FBI to stay out of this. Yeah, right. Let's do it. And he's talking to Haldeman. And then there's hush money. How much money will it take? Well, we got the money. We can do that. Again, one of the problems that Nixon had in 1972 was he had too much campaign money. They didn't know how to spend it. Boy, most politicians would love to have that problem, wouldn't they?
Yeah. But, applying to the Clinton case as well, I think it's very clear that if he would have come out and said, yeah, this was wrong, I shouldn't have had sex, I did it, it was wrong, I think it would have been also a blip on the radar. I think people would have forgiven him. I mean, the majority of the public did forgive him anyway.
Sure.
But if he would have never lied under oath, it would just said, yeah, I shouldn't have done it. And with his rhetorical gifts, he could have packaged this in such a way that I think would have diminished it and would have sold it to the American people. Not everybody, of course, but sold it to the American people that, that he was contrite and that he was sorry he did this. And I think we could have moved on from there.
So the Republicans control both houses of Congress in 1998, 1999. Newt Gingrich is the speaker. Who it turns out had his own skeletons in the closet, sexual, and they vote 2 articles of impeachment. One is lying under oath to the grand jury, and the other one is abuse of power.
Obstruction of justice.
Obstruction of justice, right. Yeah. Now, you're a Republican senator from Illinois. You vote to convict?
I'm a Republican senator from Illinois.
Yeah.
I probably vote to impeach him if I'm a Republican senator from Illinois. I mean, the fact is, not every Republican, I forget the number. I think it was about 10. I mean, it was a little bit different on the 2 counts. I think it was 9 or 10, 9 on one and 10 on the other, I believe, if I remember correctly. I probably, if I'm from Illinois, which is then still kind of a swing state, but certainly not a strong Republican state, maybe I vote. I'm trying to, do you remember who Illinois senators were then? I don't remember.
No, well, one of them, I'm trying to think. Dirksen was dead. Durbin was a senator, I think.
Was he already then, or was he still in the House?
I can't remember. How about Carol Moseley Braun? Was she in the Senate by then?
I think so.
I think that's
maybe it was Carol Moseley Braun.
I think she was elected in 98 or 96 or something for one term. Yeah.
Yeah, and so.
It'll be amazing.
Yeah. So maybe I do. I think you raise an interesting point about how and I know where we're going with this, and I think.
No, I wouldn't do that to you. Yeah, I would.
One thing that bothers me about our politics is I'll give you mentioned Kenneth Starr earlier. So Kenneth Starr came out during President Trump's first impeachment and said, the problem with American politics today is there's too many impeachments. And my jaw dropped when I heard this. I mean, really?
Say that,
you have of all people to say that, you have no self-knowledge or any intellectual honesty. But I guess I need to apply that to myself too. I thought Clinton was a pretty good president. So am I just, am I overlooking his flaws? I mean, he did clearly break the law. I don't think lying under oath is a minor matter. Am I being... So yeah, I guess the question is, if I'm a Democratic senator, yeah, I think I definitely vote no to convict him. But I do, I guess, want to interrogate myself in the sense that, am I overlooking this because I like Clinton and I think he's an okay guy? I thought it was a decent president. So,
well,
I think
the Republicans had a 55 to 45 majority in the Senate.
Yeah.
And on the first charge, 10 Republicans voted not to convict. It was
Right.
45-55.
Right. Now, so I guess the other one was just five.
Five, but 50-50.
Yeah, 50.
I mean, that's a terrible showing. And it's people, it's all kinds. It's like Richard Shelby, who's a very conservative senator from Alabama. It's Schweiker from Pennsylvania. It's people all across the spectrum. I mean, he got loyalty from the Democrats in the Senate, but he escapes. Now, the ramifications of this, do you think Clinton sort of betraying the public trust? I mean, his poll numbers stay very steady, but when you ask things like morality in government and morality in public life, he does very poorly in 1998, 1999, 2000. Do you think it cost Gore the election?
Yes, I do. Again, this is a very close election. I mean, I think there were other things that came into play, but I think Clinton, first of all, not really. Well, looking back on that, I think there was a lot of tension. They were pretty close through much of Clinton's presidency, but there was tension at the end. I think Gore felt like Clinton didn't do enough to sort of both repent and sell the public on the idea that he was wrong in what he had done, and also to campaign, frankly, aggressively enough for Gore. And there's a lot of speculation that Clinton had a hard time leaving the spotlight, and that he was afraid that if Gore were elected, that he would be seen as someone who carried out the Clinton policies, but was more reputable and honest and so forth, and that would shine a bad light retrospectively.
I mean, if Gore carries Arkansas,
yeah,
they don't need Florida,
right?
Okay, he wins,
right,
and that's Clinton's home state, and he'd been easily reelected both times. Democrats they're both senators were Democrats then. It would have been you would never have heard about the Supreme Court case.
Right. So why can't Clinton deliver Arkansas for Gore?
Yeah. So he just didn't. And I'm told there was like an hour-long meeting after the election was settled between Gore and Clinton in the White House, where they laid into each other. And Gore says, I couldn't. You betrayed me when you did this with Monica Lewinsky. You caught me by surprise too. And I couldn't get too close to you. You were toxic in lots of ways, and Clinton denied that. And I think they've been estranged ever since.
I had understood that after 9/11, they did.
Did they get back together?
They did kind of reconcile to some degree. Now, I'm not sure where they are right now, but for a long period, well, at least for a year and a half period, that they were, I think, not talking at all.
But couldn't you argue too that Gore did not carry Tennessee without living
Correct.
in Nashville?
Yeah, no, that's a good point, because I was thinking of that too. So some of that's on Gore. He can't carry his home state.
That's true. The last president who got elected who didn't carry his home state, I just happened to find this, was James K. Polk in 1844. He didn't carry Tennessee.
Well, actually, Trump didn't carry New York.
Well, that's true. I think of Trump as from being from Florida, but yeah, you're right.
Yeah, I mean, at the time he was from New York. So.
Yeah.
Point about New York.
Yeah, I mean, if he carries Tennessee, or West Virginia was still electing Democrats in. It's only 3 or 4 electoral votes. That wins it. maybe if Trump wasn't, I mean, if Gore wasn't so clunky when he talks, I mean, he just does all kinds of things here. I mean, George W. Bush did not run a stellar campaign. I mean, he had problems as well. You know? They called Florida at first for the Democrats. The talking heads had never quite explained that away very well. But okay, so we talk about the elephant in the room, Trump.
All right.
Now, Donald Trump is an unusual presidential candidate. In what ways would you say?
Well, first of all, he has no elected office or military experience, and I think that's the only president.
The only
that's
one.
The case.
Yes.
That has not either held elected office or been a high military officer, and so Trump was neither of these. He is not unprecedented, but certainly unusual in not winning and becoming elected with not winning the popular vote. Now, of course, there are other examples like George W. Bush in 2000, but lost it significantly. You know, ended up losing the popular vote by 3% or so.
Yeah.
In the 2016 election. I think that, you know, his behavior clearly, or his political approach was different in the sense that all previous presidents I could think of ran with some idea of, I'm the president of the whole country rather than the president of my base. And I think that President Trump really, and of course, you're going to run on your base to some degree, but I guess maybe a different way to put it is that the political science assumption has always been that you win elections in the middle. So you have to hold on. There's a dance of holding on to your strong supporters, but also trying to reach out to people in the middle. I think Trump threw that out the window. You know, he was never able to get a majority of the votes. And he really emphasized this idea of turning out his strongest supporters. And that was enough to get him an electoral college victory in 2016, almost enough, honestly, to do it in 2020. I mean, if a few votes in places like Wisconsin, Arizona, Nevada would have shifted, then he could have done it again, even though he lost the popular vote by an even bigger margin.
Almost 8 million.
Yeah.
Would you argue, let's go look at 2016 for a minute. Would you argue that Russian interference in the election was crucial in Trump's victory? Or was it more crucial in the defeat of Hillary Clinton?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think, you know, that's a heads or tails question a little bit, but I guess I would say it's more in the defeat of Hillary Clinton. I mean, I think, you know, the Russian social media operation and, you know, what actually happened in terms of all the things that we probably will never know, what all the dynamics, but I guess just focusing on what we are most aware of, the idea that Russian social media efforts were used to discredit Hillary Clinton, and, you know, hack her campaign emails and things like that. I guess I would say that it was more a factor of discrediting her.
Or could you say, to get minute about it, James Comey won the election for
You could say
Trump.
that. I mean, I saw this picture of James Comey where he was wearing a T-shirt that said "Elect more women," and I was kind of thinking, dude, there was a way you could have done that by
not go public with that.
by not, as had been the tradition of not going public with investigations, you know, in the last minute of an election. So yeah, I think you could say that too. So I mean, I think all these.
I mean, that disclosure was almost virtually instantaneous with the famous tape of Trump talking about grabbing strange women by their private parts.
Right.
And, you know, I mean, under ordinary circumstances, that loses you an election, or at least it makes people stop and think a little bit. But then this thing about Hillary Clinton's emails. And again, the Clintons have this reputation, whether it's deserved or not, of sort of living on the edge, never quite obeying the rules like everybody else, always finding an edge, taking extra money, winning big, lecture fees and so forth. So you got this kind of sleaze factor that kind of predisposes people to think in that direction.
Well, and I think reinforcing that is, if you look at most presidents, I mean, if you go back further in history, say pre-World War II, this may not apply as much, but you don't have a lot of examples of people who had a long record in Washington politics becoming president. So you have people like Barack Obama, who enters national politics, and then 4 years later, he's president. You have JFK, kind of a similar thing. You also have people like Ronald Reagan and George Bush, Jimmy Carter, who are governors, and sort of build their reputation that way, but don't spend a lot of time on the national scene before they're elected
Orange
president.
Harding, Hoover. I mean, Hoover's been in the public eye for a long time, but it's mostly through raising money to help starving people in Europe. The great engineer, Harding was a mediocre one-term senator.
Right, or Eisenhower, he's not a Washington politician. He's certainly, in the public eye as commander and general during World War II, but not a Washington politician.
Right.
Hillary Clinton, was in the Senate for a while, but I think was considered a Washington politician all the time when Bill Clinton was president as well. She was very active in his healthcare policy debates. And so I think from that perspective, she had built up a lot of baggage, and that hurt her as well, or at least set the stage for her to be viewed negatively. And then you add in the email business, you add in the social media efforts by the Russians, and I think it becomes a perfect storm.
The fact that she was a woman, and a lot of people are predisposed to vote against prominent, outspoken women.
Right. I think that as well. And you could, I don't honestly buy these arguments as much, but you could critique some of her campaign strategy, the idea that she didn't go to Wisconsin enough, and some of these things. There may be some merit to that.
So let's look at the first impeachment. That's kind of strange, isn't it? The first impeachment of two. What is the Mueller report?
Well, so the Mueller report is this investigation of Russian involvement primarily in the 2016 election, and as well as some other things like involving the firing of James Comey as FBI director and some other related things, but primarily focusing on Russian involvement in the 2016 election. And so this was this investigation that Robert Mueller, who was the former FBI director, was the special counsel, was selected to do this investigation. And I think, let me back up a little bit. I think from day one of the Trump administration, there were calls to impeach him due to perceived irregularities in the election and other things. If you remember Tom Steyer, this multi-billionaire who ran briefly for the Democratic nomination for president in 2020. He created this organization to try to impeach Trump from the get-go. But I think a lot of people who were looking to impeach Trump saw the Mueller report as this is kind of the equivalent of the Starr investigation during the Clinton era, and this is going to be the chance to put some evidence behind efforts to impeach Trump. So then when Mueller went before Congress, it kind of turned out to be sort of a dud. He basically took a kind of hands-off stance on whether Trump should be impeached or not. If I recall, he had said, okay, I'm not saying he did obstruct justice. I'm not saying he didn't obstruct justice.
He never exonerated him.
He never exonerated, but he never really explicitly said he had done any of these things either. And so he left a lot of ambiguity, and that kind of opened up the door for some of Trump's supporters to say, this, if not exonerates Trump, it really doesn't show any evidence that he's done anything wrong. And meanwhile, it sort of opened the door for a lot of conspiracy theories that the Democrats were engaged in false flag operations in Russia, and that they were really the ones behind this, and that they were sort of blaming this on Trump. And so, I think the ambiguity of the Mueller report really opened up a lot of opportunity to muddy the waters about what really happened in the 2016 election. And so I think that was an initial disappointment to those who were supporting Trump's impeachment, and instead it kind of lost a lot of air until this business with the phone call with the leader of the Ukraine, where there would look to be a quid pro quo, where defense aid would be contingent on an investigation of Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's son. And so that reinvigorated this effort to impeach Trump, and that's when it really kind of caught fire and led to the first Trump impeachment, of course.
This phone call and this effort to discredit Biden and Biden's son is in the summer of 2019. So his assumption was that Biden was going to be the presidential nominee of the Democratic Party. It wasn't all that clear in 2019 to most people, was it?
Well, I think, I don't know that he was assuming he would be the nominee, but I think Trump saw him as the most dangerous nominee, rightfully so.
Yeah.
And so I think he saw, if I can knock this guy off, I can beat Bernie Sanders, or I can beat
Kamala Harris.
We didn't know Pete Buttigieg, we didn't know who all these people were going to be. But I think Trump rightfully saw Joe Biden as the most dangerous potential opponent, and that if he could knock him off somehow, that would be in his political interest to do that.
Okay, so the Democrats follow again first over the kind of reluctance of Nancy Pelosi, and then by September, October of 2019, they begin the process of impeachment. And the charge is simply what? It has to do with that phone call, does it not? And is it obstruction of justice?
Well,
abuse
it's obstruction
of
of Congress, actually,
that's
the investigation, and then abuse of power was the other one. So there were two counts, so that he was abusing his power by allegedly denying this congressionally designated foreign aid or military aid to the Ukraine, by denying that or threatening to deny that he was abusing his power, and then obstruction of Congress by not allowing members of the administration and others to testify about what had happened related
by
to
claiming executive privilege, essentially, right?
Right.
Now, the timing is interesting. We've looked at several other impeachments where the president is involved is likely not going to be renominated, and in two other cases can't be renominated because he's going to be using up the second term. In this case, Trump has not finished his first term, and the Democrats have to assume, as do virtually all Republicans, that Trump is going to be renominated. So in a sense, this is a way of stopping the Trump nominating process.
Well, I don't think it's stopping the nominating process, but that's stopping the possibility of re-election. So I think discrediting him in the sense that that he would be a more vulnerable candidate. I honestly don't think that it worked from there. I think what did him in the end was COVID more than anything else.
Yeah, I agree with you. But the Democrats in the fall of 2019, they cannot assume they're going to win this impeachment process. They can't. There's no way the Republicans control the Senate by several votes. Was it 53 to 47, something like that? And they might pick off Mitt Romney, but they're not the Republicans. They're not going to get 2/3. What were they thinking?
Well, so again, I think this is following the lead of the Clinton case with. Well, it is a little bit different since, as you say, he's in his first term. But yeah. I think there was an effort in the Clinton impeachment to discredit Clinton, and by implication, the Democrats. And I think to some degree that worked in the 2000 election.
Sure did.
I think the political incentives for the Democrats are the same to weaken Trump as a candidate through the impeachment process. So, I mean, again, I think, like with this most recent impeachment, I think if they're smart, and I think they are, they realize that they're not going to convict this guy. But what they do is they make him look bad. The other thing is, I think, particularly in the Senate races, they put some of the Republican senators in a difficult position where they have to, a lot of Republican senators, it doesn't really make any difference, but there are a few, I think, where it's a political dilemma for them. Susan Collins maybe would be the best example. Forcing her to decide either to go against her party or to vote for somebody who's unpopular in her state. And so I think that there are certainly political incentives involved in this to push this impeachment through.
So the impeachment process failed. Again, you're a Republican senator from Illinois. How do you vote?
I'm a Republican senator from Illinois on
Or
this.
pick any state you want, but you're in Illinois.
Well,
North Dakota's too easy. Illinois.
yeah, all right. I'm a Republican senator. I'm a Republican senator from Illinois. I vote against this.
You don't vote to impeach.
I don't vote to impeach. I'm probably not a Republican senator from Illinois because there's not such a thing anymore. But, Mitt Romney, and I'm just looking at this from a political perspective, not necessarily whether I think this is right or wrong, but Mitt Romney is the only one who votes to convict. And I think that's no accident politically. From the perspective is that Utah is the least Trumpy Republican state, clearly.
And it's a Mormon-dominated state, and Romney's a Mormon,
right.
In the Mormon hierarchy.
And he's also got a strong political base of his own in Utah. And Utah, again, I would argue, is the most anti-Trump of the Republican states. So
Trump escapes that, gets the nomination. I've got to tell you, the night of the election, I went to bed thinking he was going to win. And he was
I didn't go to
ahead.
bed till pretty late. But I at first I thought Trump was going to win.
And I couldn't believe it. I mean, I read polls like everybody else. I read 538. I look at the Cook political report. I look at Sabato's crystal ball. I look at all these things. And they missed it in 2016. And I thought, they've done it again. They've missed it again. But you're right. It's the coronavirus that kills him. It's the response to it. And it's not just that he didn't take action. According to Bob Woodward, and Trump never denied saying these things, he knew from the get-go this was a serious issue, and it was a killer kind of outbreak. And for reasons not clear to me, he played it down.
I mean, there's a theory in political science known as retrospective voting. We may have talked about this even in the election. I can't remember what I say from one day to the next, but the basic idea of this is if things are going well in the country, then people support the party in power. So that would mean that if things are going well in the country, President Trump would have been reelected. And I told my students before the election, I said, if Trump gets reelected, this means the retrospective voting theory is wrong because I don't think you can make any argument at the time that things are going well in the country. You had this pandemic and the government's not dealing with. You've got, high unemployment at the time.
Businesses closing.
Business closing, bankruptcies, people getting evicted from their homes and apartments. So I don't think things could have been going much worse. So, from the retrospective voting theory, and I do think this is what, it was upheld in this particular case, but I really do think that's what happened, is that things were going so poorly in November of 2020 that it was difficult for Trump to
and yet he gets
that.
74 million votes, which is about 10 million more than he had the first time. So obviously his base stays loyal to him, and that affects the future of the Republican Party and then the United States in lots of ways. Before we go on, Sue, have you got any questions there? Okay. Let's go ahead to he loses the election, but he never admits it yet. Although to his credit, he vacates the White House without having to be bayoneted out.
I have to say that's a low bar.
That's right.
I wouldn't give him too much credit for that.
Okay, fair enough. So then you've got the assault on the Capitol, following hard on the heels of Trump whipping the crowd up. It's alleged he was slow to denounce the crowd or tell them to go home. He may have even watched it on television with some glee. We're not clear about that. And so a couple of days after this, Democrats pursue impeachment again. Now, I got to tell you, of all the impeachment processes, Andrew Johnson, Clinton, the Nixon process, which was aborted by his resignation, and the first impeachment, I find this one as the biggest reach. First, because I'm not sure it's constitutional to impeach somebody who's going to be out of office very soon, although they started the process when he was in office. I would have preferred that the American people make the decision about who's going to run for president in 2024 than have the Senate impeach somebody, find them guilty, and then vote that they can't hold office again. But did you think the chances of victory for the Democrats was stronger this time than the one it was 2019, 2020?
I think, let me put it this way. I think the January 6th events were searing for many members of Congress because they did rightfully fear for their lives.
Yeah, they were in the building.
So for me, legally, I agree with you. I think this is the biggest reach. I think it's the most questionable. If you ask me would I voted for it, I'm going to put I would have split the baby. I think I would have voted for it if I was in the House. I think I would have not voted to convict if I was in the Senate. And the reason I would say that is because I think the events of January 6th are so serious. I think the idea that those need to be put before the public in the fullest possible terms, I think that's very important. At the same time, I have questions about whether you can really convict somebody who's already not president anymore. And so I think on that ground, and even from the perspective of what he had done wrong, I think a lot of his rhetoric was incendiary, but there's a lot of evidence that much of this stuff was pre-planned anyway, that I don't completely blame Trump. I would maybe blame Trumpism, but I don't blame Trump directly.
Do you think
I don't want to.
You think it would have made a difference that they called witnesses?
Huh?
Would you think it would have made a difference had they called witnesses in the procedure?
In the Senate?
Yeah.
No, I don't. But I do think it was important to have the events of January 6th on the record, and I think for everyone to remember. And I think from that perspective, I think the House did the right thing by impeaching him. I also think the Senate did the right thing by not convicting him.
I found it interesting that 7 Republicans voted to convict.
Yeah. And again, I think that's a result of how personal and visceral this was for them. That, Mike Pence could have been killed. Mitt Romney could have been killed. We know. And so I think that because it was so personal, I think that's what led to so many votes in the Senate.
You're a political scientist, as we've clearly established, which means you know about checks and balances.
Other political scientists might disagree.
But officially, and checks and balances and branches of government and precedents, all these sorts of things. If you could make changes in impeachment without having to amend the Constitution, and maybe you'll have to do that anyway, what changes would you make to improve the process, if any?
I think I might specify a little bit more clearly what's an impeachable offense. I was thinking about this question, and I don't have a real good answer. I do think impeachment should be a last resort. I don't think this is something we should take in and I do actually agree with Kenneth Starr in a way that we have too many impeachments. But I think he's clearly part of the problem. So that's my critique is like, okay, dude, you're the one who got this ball rolling. So, I think maybe I don't. I guess there's already been this motion filed, at least to impeach Biden by Marjorie Taylor Greene or somebody,
yes,
or maybe it was
somebody
Lauren,
like
whatever.
that. Yeah.
And so, I think this is nonsensical. And if that's where we're going, I don't want that. Whichever party's in the presidency, I don't like this idea that we're constantly impeaching people. I think that elections are the way we should decide who's president. And so, you know, I guess the one change I might make is to specify a little bit more clearly what would be impeachable offenses.
How about moving conviction from 2/3 to 60%?
Well, I think that's going the other way, honestly, because that's going
Makes
to
it
get
more
easy.
interesting to
Yeah,
impeach.
I don't
think you can do that without changing the Constitution anyway. I
you
think
couldn't
it's
do that
specified.
without changing the Constitution, which would be almost impossible. But I think there should be a high bar to remove the president. And so, you know, 2/3 is a high bar, but I think maybe it's a rightfully high bar. You know, 3/5 that wouldn't have worked for even the second impeachment with Trump, so he still would not have been removed.
And it's entirely possible that if it's 60%, some of those 7 wouldn't have voted to impeach.
Good point. Yeah, I think that's
Yeah, unless you have a question, so I got one more. Go with it?
Yeah, go with it.
Okay. All right, Keith, I warned you about this. What's Trump's future? Is he going to be the presidential nominee of some party in 2024?
Well, let me say this. I'm going to, you know, and I'm someone, so keep this in mind, I once predicted Alexander Haig would be president. So you can keep that in mind.
I think it was before I knew you, but
you keep that in mind when I say this. I don't think that he will be the Republican nominee in 2024. I think it's possible that he may be the nominee of some kind of third party. And I certainly think it's possible that he would be the Republican nominee. So I'm, you know, 2 years, 3 years from now, whenever it is, you know, you can come back and say, so I'm not saying absolutely that he won't be. If I have to say plurality, I don't think he will be. I think it will be somebody else. I read this article the other day, was talking, and I think that this resonated with me. I think it's true that a lot of times these people who seem so central and so important to our political lives, they fade away faster than we think.
It reminds me of Sarah Palin.
Yeah, good analogy, I think. Yeah, Sarah Palin, she's completely disappeared now, and she looked like, you know, she could be the presidential nominee. There's a book in political science called The Party Decides, Trump's initial, and basically that the theme of this book was that the elites in a party, people like Mitch McConnell and so forth, are the ones who determine who's an appropriate nominee. Now, that obviously was not the case in 2016, but the Democratic nominee in 2020 is a good example of this, that these party elites decided, okay, Joe Biden's the one who can win. Even though he was struggling and sucking for air in some of these early primaries, they rallied around him and essentially got him the nomination, forced out some of these people like Amy Klobuchar, Pete Buttigieg, who may have extended the nomination, and got him the nomination. So if that theory is correct, you know, I think the noise of Mitch McConnell, some of the big party donors are saying, we're not going to support these people who are in favor or who are active in the events of January 6th. I think that there will be another party nominee behind Donald Trump. And I think the example you give, like Sarah Palin, is a good example of this idea that, you know, that some of these people that look like they're so central are not going to be around forever.
I agree. He's going to stay in the public limelight as much as he can. I don't think he's going to be able to survive the legal problems he's got.
That's another thing too. I mean, you know, this case in New York, the New York City DA, the Manhattan DA, I guess is technically the Manhattan DA, that Cyrus Vance, that you know, these investigations, I also wonder if people are, a lot depends on what happens with Joe Biden and so forth. But I wonder if people, even Trump supporters, are just tired of the drama, and are they going to really want more of that? Now, maybe I'm wrong about that.
My guess is that time up. Okay, it's time for us to. We still live?
Yeah.
Okay, it's time for us to say goodnight. Thank you, Keith, and thank you all. This is, as far as I know at the time, our last program for a while until we come up with some new ideas. So thank you all for your time and your courtesy in listening to us and asking questions. And thank you in the audience. And thank you, Charlene, my wife. And thank you, Keith. And thank you for all of our guests. Thank you, Sue. Good night.